Good day. There was happiness yesterday in Ukraine. The cities of Kyiv and Odessa and all the beautiful cities all across Ukraine felt immense happiness and pride yesterday because one of theirs, Oleksandr Usyk, defeated Danial Debious in a boxing match. Danial Debious was the one standing between Oleksandr Usyk, a Ukrainian heavyweight champion who already had quite a number of heavyweight titles to his name. And Daniel had the IBF belt. Usyk destroyed him. Usyk beat him up so much that by the fifth round, he just did not even know where he was again. And the fight was a knockout. But here's the thing. Usyk, in defeating Daniel Debious, did something very unique. He became the undisputed world champion for the second time, and he achieved something that only Mohammed Ali has ever achieved. If you think of boxing, and when Mohammed Ali was a boxing champion, you know it's almost a generation away. But that was not all. Oleksandr Usyk went home with $132 million projected. That's what he said was his purse. That's a lot of money for one man. That fight was considered to be the biggest purse in heavyweight history, but yet it's still not the biggest purse in boxing. 90,000 people saw that fight, and a lot of people also saw it all over the world. A lot of Ukrainians, politicians, soldiers, generals were all in London, Wembley, to see that fight. And they had one great moment of happiness. You see, Oleksandr Usyk showed the Ukrainian warrior spirit, but he's not the first to be world champion, by no means. Ukraine has had two world champions before him, two brothers. One was Vitaly Klitschko, and the other was Vladimir Klitschko. Vitaly is now the mayor of Kyiv, and he is the one who coordinates emergency services every night these days whenever the Russians rain down drones and missiles on Kyiv. But the Klitschko brothers were very formidable in their boxing days. They were very tough. One was called Dr. Steelhammer and the other was called Dr. Iron Fist. And both of them were called doctors because they had PhDs. So fighting is in the DNA of the Ukrainians. There's no doubt about it. One thing has become very clear. Ukraine has shown that even though they are outmatched by the Russians, they have the hearts of lions. They have fought very hard and very fiercely through this Ukraine-Russia war. Nobody can take that away from them. But on the subject of boxing, again, we should always understand that boxing is something that evokes national pride. There's Canelo for the Mexicans. There's Pacquiao for the Filipinos. And then there's Mayweather, even though he may not be liked by a lot of Americans, but Mayweather is one man who has, by his boxing prowess, been involved with some of the greatest purses in history. His fight with McGregor, who did a crossover from the UFC, reeled in almost $400 million. Huge amounts of money is always associated with boxing, and no combat sport has ever come close because it's a primal sport. It shows determination, it shows skills, it shows fighting spirit. And it is this fighting spirit that was exhibited by Oleksandr Usyk, who incidentally was Olympic champion, cruiserweight world champion, undisputed, and now 2 times heavyweight champion. Good day, and welcome to my channel, Ebima Amongo's perspective on global affairs. If you're new to this channel, please subscribe. If you have any comments regarding the ideas I express in my video, please put them in the comment section. Ukraine had a high yesterday night But the sad reality of Ukraine's problems is being clear for everybody to see. One of the instigators, ironically, of this present-day Ukraine problem, Boris Johnson, former Prime Minister of Britain, said recently at the Ukrainian embassy in London, in an interview he gave to the Telegraph newspaper, that the people of Britain are not so much interested in the goings on in Ukraine anymore. They don't have that favor to support Ukraine as they once had. You see, at the beginning point of this war in 2022, 24th of April, February 2022, there was a strong favor to support Ukraine. 70% of people polled one time supported Ukraine, and only 3% of people felt that giving Ukraine any amount of money was too much. But a recent poll just showed that it's only 50% of the people who believe that Ukraine should be supported that way. And over 20% of the people, or 25% now, feel that it's too much, any amount of money that will be sent by Britain to Ukraine. Already, Britain has sent 18 billion pounds to Ukraine in military materials and other forms of assistance. And nobody can take away the fact that Britain has been the biggest cheerleader of the Ukrainian cause, starting with Boris Johnson, who had a historical role to play in this war, because it was Boris Johnson who flew into Kyiv in the days of the negotiations going on in Istanbul, and when the Russians had put their memorandum across to the Ukrainians in that Istanbul meeting. He was dispatched then by the Biden administration, and for his own reasons, because he was undergoing a probe then for his activities during COVID. So he had problems back home, but he went and convinced the Ukrainians that they should not accept the terms and the memorandum and the ultimatums of the Russians, and that Britain and the collective West and NATO was going to support them. So that agreement that was supposed to have been reached, almost signed in Istanbul, was shredded and torn up. The Ukrainians chose a different path of history. They chose to fight the Russians. Johnson's role in that event has been said repeatedly. It has been touted repeatedly as the proximal cause of Ukraine going headlong into a very foolhardy war with the Russians. These days, the British have taken up the mantle where Johnson left. Rishi Sunak, who was the prime minister, I think, after Johnson took over, the three prime ministers, including Rishi Sunak, Liz Truss, and now Keir Starmer, have continued to fly the flag of continuous and total support of the British people for the Ukrainians in this cause. They have made sure that in every forum and in every opportunity, they undermine the Russians, they put sanctions on the Russians, and they seize the assets and the money and all the things of Russian state and Russian oligarchs close to anywhere near within England and London, any jurisdiction that they have control over. They have used their power and influence in insurance to block out the Russian fleet that supplies oil to or sells Russian oil. The British have been unrelenting, and they have been a dogged opponent of the Russians and a strong stanchion of support of the Ukrainians. In fact, the British have even gone ahead and tried to form a coalition of the willing, a coalition where they will have boots on ground from countries willing to support Ukraine. The Russians have said in an unclear terms, very clearly, that they will destroy any European that dares to enter the Ukrainian territory with the foolhardy idea of fighting for Ukraine. Already the French have found out. The French have found out hard way. When they are in some hotels, French instructors, Swedish instructors, British instructors have been blown up all across Ukraine in several cities. Those who come to instruct the Ukrainians in how to use the multiple weapon systems that they give that has been donated by NATO from NATO countries. The Russians target them in their hotels and blow them up. Of course, most times the countries don't even say that those instructors were there. What they just do is that they get more aggressive on the diplomatic space. So the support for Ukraine is waning, and this is now causing a little bit of distress for the Ukrainians. Because every day when we look at programs that show advances in this war, programs like the mapping programs, summary that shows all the movement of the military, the mapping channels that we have on YouTube, and all the programs that we have a military summary channel, all channels that shows us activities in the war daily. It just doesn't seem good for the Ukrainians. They're losing territory. They're on the back foot. They are being encircled. They are being bottled into cold runs. They are stumbling here and there. But just like Usyk, they do put up a fight. The spirit of the Ukrainians can never be doubted. We saw that in Bakhmut. They fought unrelentlessly. They fought and held down the Wagner group for several months, 6 months specifically. They lost and inflicted heavy damage and heavy casualties on the Wagner group, but eventually they lost Bakhmut. The same thing too happened in Avdiivka. They hung on to Avdiivka even when they were clearly encircled and they were in a cold run. They fought on until a very miraculous pipeline operation brought the Russians into the middle of Avdiivka and scattered them, and they lost Avdiivka, but they hung on. Ugledar, same thing happened in Ugledar. They hung on and fought and fought. This war has not been an easy one for the Russians. The Ukrainians have shown spirit, that they do have the spirit. And even though they've been given huge amount and huge quantities of weaponry by the NATO group, it's the fact that the Ukrainians have taken this war to the Russians that has made this war last this long, 3 years. To a large extent, the Russians have achieved a lot. We know that. They've taken 4 oblasts: Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporozhye, Kherson. They're almost there. They're almost there. They have taken huge slices of all these 4 oblasts. They now have territories in Sumy and Kyiv, and then so the Russians are slowly meeting up their objectives, and they are right by the Dnipro River. But the Ukrainians are not making it easy. Because if we look at this now, we should understand that the Russians are a war-fighting group, because you don't come to own the largest country in the world by being nice. They have as much skills in diplomacy, they have as much skills as the British have in all the strengths that the British have, which is proper war-fighting spirit and unconventional tactics that includes duplicity. The Russians also know how to do that. Duplicity, bribery, and all the things that give states advantages in warfare. Don't think it's just about me and you standing in front of each other and blowing each other. No. There are still some other underhand methods. Because how do you think the Russians have survived this bliss of unrelenting sanctions that has been thrown at them? They've put on their coats and dispatched their diplomats, and they are making deals all across the world. Recently, Japan had to fall to their deal. $57 per barrel for the oil. Japan took it. Japan is suffering from the blowback from this war because they, in solidarity with NATO, joined the Western coalition in putting sanctions and placing sanctions on Russia. But they forget that their LNG comes from the Sakhalin, their oil comes from Russia, and they just have by far more vulnerability, because if they are importing oil from the Middle East, it's a longer distance for them. Russia was just next door. Besides that, They got outpriced and muzzled out of the oil markets by the Europeans, who now had to scramble to the Middle East to go and make new friends and try to buy oil and buy gas. The Japanese were muzzled out of it. So the Japanese have quietly come back to dealing with the Russians because the Russians are good at making deals. They've made deals and now they have the biggest wheat suppliers to Africa, Egypt. Nigeria now has 5 times the amount of wheat they used to buy from America. Now they buy almost 5 times from Russia. They are selling wheat to Mozambique, selling fertilizer all across. The Russians have shown a level of trade and enterprise that is beyond what anybody expected of them. They are not just selling only the traditional products that we know them with, arms and grains, and even corn. They are disrupting the markets for farmers, even in America, because they have moved into markets that used to be controlled by American farmers, and they have displaced them, taking the market share from them in several produce and products. The Russians are very good. The British have found their match, and they're not relenting in expanding their associates and friends all across the world. Now they have Indonesia, where they are planning on building a new nuclear plant. They have Malaysia. They are building one in Turkey, even though they've had a very, very uneasy relationship with the Turks because they've lived with the Turks for over 500 years. They've had front and back wars across the Black Sea. They've had a strong and funny relationship. But now they are dealing with an Erdogan that is very duplicitous and very slippery. But Erdogan is happy that he has been made a hub for selling Russian oil and gas. The Turk Stream gas pipeline is one gift to Erdogan and Turkey that has made him sometimes want to go against the interest of Russia, but the other times working for the interest of Russia. He is quite not in tune to a large extent with his NATO member brothers. He looks after Turkish interest in his relationship with Russia. And that has a lot to do with the diplomacy and the negotiating power of the Russians. But in all, the Ukrainians are losing it. They're not happy. And when President Donald Trump now says that he is going to cut off all direct payments of aid and assistance to Ukraine, he expects the Europeans to pick this tab up, or through an instrument of payment by NATO, there's instant rebellion, and that shows that the interest they used to have for Ukraine is waning. Czech Republic, we used to be a very strong supporter of Ukraine, was the first to say they're not going to put in any support in buying military hardware for Ukraine from America. France says we have an indigenous military industry that we would rather buy from. Spain has said they're not part of that enterprise. Italy has said, count me out. This was not what used to be the refrain for Ukraine before. It used to be complete and total. We'll support you as long as it takes. Ironically, another person who supported and prompted and pushed Ukraine into this war, Jens Stoltenberg, the former NATO Secretary General, has come up and said that, yes, to find peace, maybe Ukraine may have to concede territory. Conceding territory and the reality of the present-day reality of the war and how they cannot shake out the Russians from wherever the Russians have occupied has led to the point where recently President Zelensky called and initiated for the very first time further discussions that may lead to a ceasefire. It will be the first time it will be coming off his prompting. So when we look at the fact that Ukraine is on the back foot, Ukraine is now losing its supporters. Ukraine has lost its biggest supporter in America. And Ukraine is losing the support of those in Europe, especially in France, in Germany, where the AfD is doing very well, even though they have a very big, belligerent new leader and cheerleader for the Ukrainian cause in the Friedrich Merz, the new chancellor, the general populace of Germany is actually calling for better relationship with Russia so that they can start buying the Russian gas again. But to make sure that that never happens, the EU in its 18th round of sanctions has said that the Nord Stream pipeline can never be reactivated again. They've placed the sanctions on that infrastructure so much so that Russian gas can never come into Europe again. This is at variance with what the people of the countries being discussed want. And that is why, to a large extent, the traditional parties in government are losing to radical parties now. So parties that they call far-left parties. They call them all manners of names so that in their means and in their attempt to undermine those parties. They are calling also for greater spending. The EU, under Ursula von der Leyen as the EU Commission President, has said that they are going to set up $150 billion fund for countries that want to increase their military spending. Those who are in NATO have pledged that they will increase their spending in NATO to 5% of their GDP. Ursula von der Leyen has said they are going to raise an $800 billion budget, all in supporting Ukraine. But the truth is, those are very Herculean impossibilities. And it just seems like the reality of Ukraine's slide into defeat is just a few days away, few months away, few years away. However long it will take, it will eventually happen. We should not forget that one Russian official reminded the world that it took Catherine the Great 21 years for her to win one of her wars and her battles and for a territory she coveted. It may not take the Russians 21 years to defeat Ukraine, but it just shows that the Russians are also a patient lot in achieving the objectives they want to achieve. So even though there was happiness in Ukraine due to Oleksandr Usyk's victory, the clear reality of their condition should be staring them the day after. Because anytime we watch and listen to updates on the war, it just isn't sounding good for Ukraine. This is where I end my video for today. If you have any comments, please put them in the comment section. If you're new to this channel, please subscribe. And the least you can do is like and share. Thank you until I see you in my next video.